Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Daily Fantasy Digest podcast, the all-inclusive podcast where we talk all things fantasy sports to help give you an edge. Once again, I'm your host, Joe Bewer, and I am back here today with a very special guest from Rotogrinders. He is a writer over at Rotogrinders and a contributor over at DK Live. I have Allan Lem on the line with me. Allan, how's it going?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, of course. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Just for everybody listening, it is not going to be a breakdown. This is going to be an interview where we go ahead and dive into some deeper things on the daily fantasy side. Not so much strategy, but more of daily fantasy as a whole, where it's headed. So I think this is going to be an interesting one for everybody to hear. So I'm pretty interested. I actually selected Allan. I actually selected you for this episode on purpose because it seems like you've been in the daily fantasy world for quite some while. So I'm interested to hear your sort of backstory as it comes to daily fantasy.
Yeah, I started playing in 2015. I actually saw a Derek Carty podcast that he, was promoting DFS, and so I've been playing season-long fantasy sports for close to a decade. Before that, I grew up playing season-long, and so daily fantasy was sort of this new, refreshing concept for me. So really got into it in 2015. And in 2016, that's when DraftKings launched their NBA preseason DFS, and it was brand new, and there was no information out there. So I had just listened to an Adam Levitan interview, and something that really stood out to me was that Adam uses his social media to promote information and to share information. And I thought that was just a really interesting concept. And so when I started doing my own research for NBA preseason, there was nothing out there. So I had to really just do all the information myself. And I just thought, why not take Adam's concept of sharing information and just putting it out there? So, I had been a Rotogrinders user at that time. I was on the chat rooms and on the forums, and I just started my own blog at Rotogrinders and just posted all the information that I had scraped through and collected on NBA preseason. And that's sort of what happened is, I just opened my own Rotogrinders account, and I posted all the information. And sort of my big break came when Dan Bach actually posted my blog on his Twitter account and sort of retweeted and said, this is someone you should consider following. And sort of my big break came that way. And for the rest of the preseason, I just kept blogging and got my content out there and got my name out there.
So NBA was pretty much a start for you then.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, preseason was brand new at that time, so I was kind of lucky to catch a break at that time.
So is NBA? Are you when it comes to fantasy? Are you a firm believer in playing all sports, or are you just sort of specific to one sport?
So I personally play NBA, MLB, and NFL, but I think I think there's so much content and so many sports out there now. I think it actually makes sense to either pick the one that you feel like you have an edge in, or feel like you just enjoy it more. I mean, I honestly, like, I've dabbled in tennis and golf and WNBA,
Right.
EuroLeague. Like, there's just so much out there. And I think at some point I had to sort of cut off some sports and realize, it's just, there's so much that I just needed to focus on the ones that I really enjoyed or felt like I had an edge.
I think there's a difference between the people that are really trying to do this just for fun and pastime and the people that are actually trying to make money. Because I think that, for the people who selectively choose the sports that they're going to play DK or FanDuel on, are the ones who are trying to make money. But I myself am the same victim. I'll play PGA and I'll be like, oh, I know Tiger Woods. He's decent. So, it's like, I think that a lot of people have at least dabbled in every sport so far. But, I mean, it always comes down to the core baseball, NBA, NFL that are going to be the ones that are just like the main profiters that everybody knows. And for those types of people who play the other ones, that actually kind of gives you some sort of edge over the competition. If you're sort of proficient in those sports, you can kind of wean out the lesser, informative players.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about lately. We've got right now at our current time, we've got so many sports going on that I actually think there is merit to actually kind of going all in on one of the the fringe sports, or sort of the sports that maybe people aren't looking at. And I think WNBA is a prime example. Just
Yeah.
the season just launched, and again, information is pretty scarce out there. And unless you are willing to watch all the games, buy WNBA League Pass, do all the research, I think there is an edge there. And I think it just comes down to whether you're willing to put in the work or not.
Right, and I've seen a lot of people actually recently come and jump on the WNBA train, trying to actually gain some sort of edge. And a lot of lineup providers that I've seen recently have done that. That kind of brings me into something that I'm interested about from your perspective, since you are a writer and contributor. You give your stuff, you give information. You don't give. You're not telling somebody play LeBron James on this specific night, and this you're not telling them to do that, but these lineup providers are providing lineups um, identical, like just plug and play. And for the people like myself, I play every day. I'm going to be honest, and I make my own lineups like from scratch. I don't really use too much information. I just think it's more enjoyable that way. It kind of sucks when you're in a cash game or a GPP contest and you have 50 guys at the top all with the same score in the same lineup.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the ecosystem has definitely changed to the point where, we've got lineup providers, we have, lineup optimizers. And I mean, to your point, that's something that I had to kind of struggle and learn early on even as a blogger. I mean, people were coming to me asking me, do I play this person or this person? And, I wanted to help them. But I think I came to realize personally that I didn't want to give someone, advice where they didn't cash. And
Right.
yeah, I would just feel, personally bad. And so I think something that I think Rotogrinders, and at least myself, that I try to accomplish during in my writing, is to sort of give the analytical skills, or at least the framework of sort of how I'm approaching a slate or a player, and then sort of give people the full breakdown of this is what I'm thinking, this is how I'm approaching it. But ultimately, it is up to you to make the decisions.
Right. So for me, let's put this into perspective. This is a fairly new podcast, fairly new channel. I'm doing breakdowns and stuff myself. I've come to kind of, excuse me, understand that people really, as much analytics as I can give, they really just don't care. Like at the end of the
Right.
day, it's like they want you to tell them who you feel is great, and they don't really need that reason why. And if enough people say that it's great out of over the 10 videos that they watch, they're going to be sold.
Exactly. And I mean, that's why lineup providers still exist in this ecosystem. It's that people want the easy route. They want, to make money, and ultimately that is the reason why a lot of people play, and it's understandable. But again, not why, you know, that's not why I write. That's not why you provide, your podcast. It's to sort of give people the tools. And yeah, I think until I don't know if that's ever going to go away. I think that's why lineup providers still exist. But ultimately, I hope that we would get to a point where the idea and the concept of just trying to learn how to fish would be more prevalent.
Right. And I think that something that I'm really trying to promote on my podcast so far is that I'm not a big fan of lineup providers, and I'm a firm believer in that the slate breakdowns aren't going to make my channel pop. They're not going to make it blow up. Everybody does a slate breakdown. A kid on his phone can screen record off his iPhone and make a slate breakdown. It's not that tough. I'm more so interested in doing the interviews and kind of filling in with the breakdown, still giving my own personal opinion. But the interviews, I think, are the most informative thing that I can give here. If I break down a slate with somebody else, it gives two perspectives, because I could be wrong. Like, everybody can be wrong. But I think that a lot of people from the interviews, especially that I do, can take away some extra information to the point where it almost sort of sounds like a little bit of motivation to go make your own actual lineups. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are several aspects there that you just touched on, where if someone asked me, how would I approach breaking into the DFS industry, I think one is just get your content out there. If you have a passion for writing, just write. Get your work out there. I think another thing that I would tell someone is approach it in a way or focus on a sport that isn't as heavily covered. Like there aren't any, or there probably aren't too many WNBA podcasts, for example, or
Right.
DFS tennis podcasts. And so I think that's another way to sort of break into it. But yeah, I totally agree. Like just starting somewhere, I think that's the hardest part for several people. And whether it's starting your own podcast or starting your own blog, like I love that type of content because it shows me someone's willing
It's
to
grinding,
put
man.
themselves out there. It's very grinding, like just putting together a podcast or putting together an article. I don't think people see the work that goes behind the scenes, because you're not just hopping on a podcast and talking about a slate, on the go. You're probably doing, hours of research beforehand so that you can come on the podcast and give your analytical insights.
Right, and it's crazy because I read a statistic the other day, and I've had a bunch of people tell me this as I've done some interviews. People are telling me like, don't stop. Like you got something going here. Like you're getting you're getting people to do interviews here, and I've had a statistic thrown out to me a few times. Are you aware that 70% of podcasts don't make it to episode 10?
Well, I didn't know that, but that I believe it though. Yeah.
It's crazy. It's like people lose their drive if they don't have instant success.
Right.
And
Yeah. I mean, I
that's
think it's the same with, it's the same with, DFS industry as well. Like it's, if, you want, the likes and the retweets, you want the comments. I think that's just sort of the age we live in. But yeah, I think the encouragement I would just give is just keep getting your content out there.
and that's why lineup providers are still a thing, because you get quick cash. It's quick,
Exactly.
and that's exactly what people want. So a question that I have: do you do daily fantasy for a living? Like this is your only gig?
It's not. I work full time. I have a job. I have a family. I have a mortgage. So I don't think I could handle DFS full time. I do know, some people do that for a living, but I think there are just so many swings, and I think it comes down to your personality. It comes down to your current life stage and your risk tolerance. I think for me, I've always been someone that just plays it safe. And the 9 to 5 job, again, it's not glamorous, but I value the aspect of making sure that I have the ability to provide for my family. And so I use DFS more as like something that's on the side and as a hobby.
Right. So do you think it's sustainable? Like, do you think it's possible to do it full time? I mean, because to do it full time, you pretty much have to have a 60% win rate. Like there's no way around it, and you need to not only be consistent in cash games, but potentially take down a GPP just in case you're going to be able to have a bad spell. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I think it is possible. It does take the right type of person to do it, and right type of personality, because again, if you're playing heavily GPPs, there's going to be so many swings. I do think you have to be probably cash game focused with mixing in GPPs so that you can get those huge cash days. But again, I would say for the for the common person, I guess it's just so volatile that to be able to do that for a living, I think it's more challenging than I think maybe people might give it credit for. I mean, even just thinking about a regular GPP, you've got the top 20% getting paid out, and then really the money's in the top 1%. So if you think about it, you really need a top 1% outcome, or even greater than that. So that's just probability wise, it's just really hard to do, on a consistent basis.
Right. And I think that if you're creating content, it's doable.
Yeah.
If you've got, that's another stream of income that can lessen the blow of a big hit. So I think that people, if they're going to try and do this full time, and whatnot, I think that content at some point needs to be a part of that as some sort of stability. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think to go a step further, I find that the days that I write my content, I feel like I have a better handle of the slate. So it kind of goes hand in hand, right? Like I'm doing the analytical background and all the digging of the players, and so I feel like I have got a good handle of the slate. So I think, yeah, I do agree that being able to have additional sources of income it's always going to be beneficial, especially if you can find opportunities to write or to blog.
So for anybody who wants to write and kind of follow the path you're going, you get paid to write, correct?
Yes, I'm fortunate enough, but there were times where when I started off, I was just doing it for free, and I just wanted to get my work out there, and I was completely fine with that. I enjoy the writing process, and so that for me was just enjoyable just to get my stuff out there.
So, I mean, I don't want to talk amounts. Just for people that are doing this, are you paid per article or as sort of like a salary?
I'm paid per article.
Oh, okay. So that's just for anybody who's listening. If there's any future in writing for you, that to me is a stream of content, and that is a form of income that could potentially, propel you into something greater. Um, but I mean that it definitely involves hours of grueling research and being sharp because I'm sure that Alan doesn't have too much wiggle room to be incorrect at a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean you'll get people tweeting at you, so
Yeah,
that's a
I
part of
know.
the DFS industry. So
Yeah. So I have a question for you. This is relating to the DFS as a whole. Obviously, DraftKings and FanDuel are like the front runners. Do you see them like staying on top, or do you see any potential new sort of apps, games coming around to kind of trump that? Because I just want to know how sustainable you think DraftKings and FanDuel are with what they have currently.
yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see what happens when sports betting becomes legalized across the U.S. because I think that will be another way for people to enjoy the aspect of sports. And my guess is that DFS isn't going to go away. I think if anything, people may supplement their DFS play with, I don't know, legalized sports gambling if that does come to pass. Um, but it's nice to see. We still have fantasy draft and Yahoo did a great job last year of having no rake and rake free contests and really promoting itself. We still have draft if you're into like best ball contests. So I do think DraftKings and FanDuel will remain the leaders for a while, and I do think DFS is it's going to be here to stay. But I do wonder what's going to happen when sports gambling gets a little bit more legalized.
So, there's two companies that I've had on this podcast or will have on this podcast. One of them, have you ever heard of Fantasy Sports Markets?
I haven't.
Okay, so they're run by a guy by the name of Ben Heisler. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, um, and it's roughly similar to DraftKings and FanDuel, but salary is non-existent. All the players are at zero.
I like that. Yeah, that's an interesting concept. That's something that I've thought about before because I think we get so consumed about spending the entire salary cap
Yep.
that we sometimes make plays that maybe aren't optimal. So yeah, the concept of no salary cap is, I think that's actually really interesting.
I would be interested to see because you could put all the stars in the NBA on one team, and that's like it's pretty much. I feel like if there's no salary cap, that pretty much puts true to the test your analytical ability of players. Because I mean, if you think about it, on any given baseball slate, there's cash game locks for the most part. They're going to be chalk. You're just going to roll with it because you don't want to miss out if they're going to be great. But you don't. If they suck, you're still in the mix. So I mean, after you pick those three cash game locks, at that point it becomes a price play for almost every one of the filler positions on DraftKings and FanDuel that you're trying to fill in. Obviously, you're going to have some sort of differential in players, but if there's no salary cap, there's no price play. So
Yeah, it's especially interesting in baseball, right, where there's just so much variance that Mike Trout on a given day is probably going to get outscored by some random person, that's going to hit 2 home runs. So I actually really like that idea for like a baseball concept.
yeah, I agree as well. And there's another one. It's called. Have you ever heard of Prize Picks?
I have seen them on social media. Yes.
And they have a competitor called Thrive Fantasy that reached out to me. They'll be coming on the podcast next week. Both of these are up and coming apps, basically promoting player props, over unders, and stuff like that. So I'm interested to hear. Do you think the player prop? Player prop to me in an app just seems like a sports book in an app. Like it doesn't seem like it's like it's a game. You know what I mean? It just seems like you're just straight betting.
I, I agree with that. I think there's an aspect that's maybe a little bit easier to consume, right? Like you don't have to necessarily figure out an entire slate, but you're just focused on maybe one or a couple players' performances. So I think from a usability standpoint or a user experience standpoint, it's probably maybe a little bit easier and maybe possibly more enjoyable. So I can see how that would be something that people sort of gravitate towards.
Right. So are you more? Have you straight up betted before?
I haven't. I enjoy the DFS sort of side, and I think that's sort of where my heart has always been, just because I've always grown up playing fantasy, season long, and so I think that's just what I enjoy the most.
If you wouldn't mind sharing what was the biggest GPP takedown?
The biggest one I've only had, let's see, the biggest one I had was 2 years ago, I think. It was for NBA. Um, it was, I think it was, four figures. I'm still looking for my first five-figure win, but yeah, I was in first place for it always happens. You're in first place for like
Yep.
the last couple of minutes, and then something always happens. I think I was a Isaiah Thomas 3 point away from taking it down, but I did settle for, I think it was a top four finish, if I believe. So, again, GPPs are so hard, right? And I think if you are the type that plays single bullet, or even if you max enter, I think there's that misconception of, I'm going to max enter, I'm guaranteed to win. I know it's just something that people have in mind, but just try it. If you max enter, you won't cover all your bases and you won't cover all the combinations. It's just so hard to take down a GPP. So I think if you ever do take one down or come close, just celebrate. Like
Right.
it's an accomplishment.
Dude, it's a grind, man. When I see some of these contests that's like 150 entries, like if you sit there and make 150 different lineups, that's got to take a lot of time. I'm sorry. Like that is it. I mean, I'm a firm believer in one lineup because I'm a big second guesser in myself. I'll sit there and I will flip flop one player and just right up until 2 minutes before a lock, and then just pray for the best because I know that I can't trust my gut sometimes, so I have to be a one lineup player because I'll be that guy who puts 85 on a lineup in cash and then puts $10 on a lineup in GPP, a different one, and I should have just played the same lineup in both, and I would be making so much more money.
Yeah, it comes down to what type of player you are and figuring out, what ways you can optimize your time. Because I'm the same way. I've come to realize that I can't play 150 lineups. It's too hard for me. I mean, there's optimizers and tools out there that help you do it. But for me, I agree with you. I'm sort of the same way where I love playing either a single entry or a three max entry and figuring out, really sitting down and thinking through strategy or game flow and sort of projected ownership and attacking it that way. So yeah, I would just say for those who are considering maybe expanding to playing more lineups, I think it comes down to how much time do you have and what can you really handle. Because if you're going to be playing 20 lineups or 150 lineups and it's overwhelming, then just don't do it. Just stick to what you can handle.
Right. So I guess how good. I mean, it's tough for me because I don't own a Fantasy Labs Rotogrinders. I don't own a subscription. I'm flying just on my own knowledge here. So
Mhm.
how good is the ownership projection? Like, how is that gauged? How good? How accurate is it?
Yeah, I mean, so since I'm a contributor for Rotogrinders, I have those projections, and I would say they're honestly they're really good. I use them daily. They're a part of my process in understanding chalk pictures and where can I gain leverage. Something that Rotogrinders recently put out is something called Slate IQ that takes data from previous slates that are very similar to the one of the current day and helping you understand, based on projected ownerships, these are stacks, these are pitchers that you can gain leverage on in the field. And so I've incorporated that into my daily play because it uses projected ownerships. And so if a stack is, for example, if a core stack is going to be 20% owned, maybe that's a place where I want to hop off and gain leverage on, some of these other stacks that are going to be underowned.
Right. So, I've had a few people from Rotogrinders on here. I recently had Kevin Roth
Yep.
on, and we talked the importance of weather. And I really want to touch on something really important that I've only touched on once on this podcast. And I think that, everybody looks too deep into the statistics, which is great. It's absolutely vital for, cashing in a slate. But as somebody who's been in DFS for so long, I'm really interested in your perspective on bankroll management for either advanced players or beginner players in general, because I'll even admit it myself, I'll lose, I'll play 100 and I'll lose, and I'll be like, all right, well, I got to play 200. I got to win it back. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's something that I struggle with sometimes too, and I have to be more disciplined in. I find myself, especially when a season starts. Maybe you just week one of NFL season. You've been waiting an entire year, right, for this time to come around, and so you want to play more than you're used to or more than you're comfortable with, and there's just always going to be variance. There's always going to be injuries. Something's going to happen, and that's the importance of it. So I agree. Like, it's kind of understanding. It comes down to really understanding yourself, right? Like, I have a tendency to play more than maybe I should on a week one or opening day, and that's just not smart because we've got the rest of the season to attack. And so if you can understand sort of where your weaknesses are, I think that's actually a part of bankroll management as well.
Right. You have a specific rule for yourself. I have a 10% rule.
I probably stick close to that as well. I don't actually have specific numbers, but I would say it's pretty close to that. Something that I've been trying to do more of is actually move towards more cash, or specifically like single entry double ups.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm trying to move towards cash is because I feel like, so I've been traditionally a GPP player, and I think the concept of taking a GPP mindset into cash games is kind of an interesting concept where I feel like I can play the chalk because I think that's what you should mostly do in cash games, but I can pivot off in maybe one or two spots where I've built up enough risk tolerance playing GPPs that I'm okay with it. And because in single or in double ups, you still need to finish in the top 44% of the field.
Right.
So you still have to beat more than half. And so I think you can't just necessarily play all chalk. There still has to be some aspect of a GPP mindset because we've got optimizers, we've got content providers, and lineup providers. It's so sharp now that I do think there could be some edge in actually being willing to take on more risk in cash games.
Right. So I'm the same with you. I'm a traditional GPP player, and I've recently, over the past month, went to single entry double ups repeatedly. Not only is it more consistent and it's easier, in my opinion, it's easier to take home some money, but I will admit the mindset of being able to not only pivot off players but go heavy contrarian when it comes to like bat stacks or position players when it comes to baseball. Baseball is a very easy sport to predict when it comes to who's going to go off and who's not. It's one of the most clear cut. The ballparks, the weather, whatever it is. Who's going to, who the top players are, who's going to show up. You just got to pick the right ones. And I think that, kind of playing GPPs for a while, dollar entries, if you're a starting player, it kind of gives you a refreshing mindset of when you go into a GPP and you see Mike Trout at 0.7% owned and you're like, what the hell? Like, he's in a great spot. Nobody plays chalk in GPPs. And it kind of gives you some sort of eye opener that, maybe, you can play here for a while, build up some sort of strategy, and then go attack single entry. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and something I've also found too in single entry double ups is the cash lines they're pretty similar if up to a certain point. So if you want to play like a $2 single entry double up and a $5 and a $10 and 25 and on and on, like the cash lines are actually somewhat similar. So you could actually if you wanted to, you just play all single entry double ups with the same line and just kind of hope that you're still finishing in the top 44% in all of them, because again the cash line is not too different in general. I think once you start getting to like the $50 and $100, then it does get sharper, obviously.
Yeah, but I mean the lower $5, $10, $25. I mean, you can get away with playing the same lineup. I mean, I play the same lineup. And I've been fairly successful just playing the same lineup. If you lose, you lose on to the next day. If not, but I just definitely think that for either entry people who are just starting out, single entry is probably the best way, because when you start getting into 3, 4, 5 entries and you only put one in, you're automatically set up for failure.
I agree with that. I've come to the point now where if I can't max enter a contest, whether it's whether it's like 3 max or 5 max, 20 max, I probably won't play, because it's sort of suboptimal knowing that the guy next to me has 20 entries that's covering more bases, and so I have to somehow beat that with my my single entry.
Right, and I just don't think that's sustainable. But I do have a question before we go ahead and kind of start wrapping this up here. What's next for Allan Lem?
That's a good question. I love writing content. I was fortunate enough to have a chance to do some podcasts and some live shows during some time off last year. Um, it's a grind. I think sometimes I contemplate just taking it easy. And I love interacting with people on Twitter, kind of just being able to talk DFS, and so I would love to do more of that. Just talk strategy, talk not even about slates, but just understanding like how would you approach single entry versus 150 entries, like those type of topics I love. I do envision myself continuing to write, and yeah, I don't know what's next for me. I think I'm keeping it open, but yeah, I do love the DFS industry, and hopefully I can stay in it as long as possible.
Well, you're certainly welcome on this podcast anytime, and we've had a great conversation here, just talking all things fantasy. I like the conversations where you kind of just get off on like a tangent and you just don't know where it's going to end up, but it's all DFS related, and it's quite interesting. To get some different perspectives on this podcast. What I think a lot of people need is to not only hear from just one specific person just beating something into their head, but kind of get a different perspective from a bunch of other people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it was definitely great. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had. I do have one last question before we go ahead and wrap this up. I know you're a big basketball fan. Who wins the finals, and what is the series count?
Oh wow! So I'm actually from the Bay Area, so I'm a Warriors fan. So
I
I'm
figured.
obviously biased. Um, but I do think this Raptors team actually sets up pretty well for the Warriors, or against the Warriors. So I do think the Warriors win, but I think it goes 6 games. So Warriors in 6.
Warriors in 6. I can see that as well. I said Warriors in 5, as they're currently losing right now as we're recording this podcast. But anyways, thanks again, Allan, for coming on the podcast. I want everybody listening to go check out Rotogrinders. Pick up a subscription if you haven't already. They're doing an incredible job over there providing content, analytics, and just anything that you can imagine DFS related to help you build the most optimal lineups per sport. Is just something that you're not going to want to miss out on. And then definitely go ahead, if you're listening, go ahead and give Allan a follow on Twitter at Allan Lem DFS. He's tweets out incredible stuff, stats all the time. It's definitely somebody that you're going to want to follow when it comes to, getting information quick for lineups. So yeah, at this time, I think we're gonna end this this interview here. So everybody listening, if you're on YouTube or Apple, just go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Like it if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date with all of the podcasts that we're pumping out. Going to continue on the same schedule with a few breakdowns and an interview per week. Hope to have Allan back on the podcast at some point, maybe for an NBA slate breakdown, NFL, something like that. Get some different perspectives just other than mine. And once again, Allan, thank you again for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for having me.
Alrighty, and until next time, peace.